Pretty excited to finally make a return to Android, and specifically an Android tablet that packs quite a punch. OnePlus returns to the tablet format with their sequel and update to the original OnePlus Pad. This time around, OnePlus is making the jump to Qualcomm's Snapdragon with the cutting-edge Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 packed into a sleek, thin, and lightweight form factor. The OnePlus Pad 2 promises to be a tremendous value for the high-end Android tablet space, and of course, as we always do here on the channel, we will examine the capabilities and gaming chops of the OnePlus Pad 2 and find out if this is a solid option for those looking at something a bit more capable and high-end in the Android tablet space. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we check out the first tablet powered by Qualcomm's Snapdragon 8 Gen 3. As we always do, let's talk specs first and get familiar with the OnePlus Pad 2, which is equipped with a beautiful 12.1-inch 7:5 aspect ratio display at a resolution of 3000 by 2120, with 600 nits of brightness and up to 900 nits with the high brightness mode, as well as supporting refresh rates up to 144 Hz. It is powered by the latest and greatest from Qualcomm, the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3, which is a first for tablets and features 8 cores with a Qualcomm Cryo core that clocks up to 3.3 GHz, as well as Adreno 750 graphics at a frequency of 903 MHz. The OnePlus Pad 2, at least for the US market, is only available in one configuration, with 12GB of onboard RAM and 256GB of UFS 3.1 internal storage. The OnePlus Pad does not feature any expandable storage, which for me is definitely a bummer to see here. On board we have Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, and a USB Type-C port for charging, data, and video out, as well as a front-facing 8-megapixel camera and a rear-facing 13-megapixel camera. Not only that, we have a pretty hefty 9510 mAh battery with support for 67-watt Super VOOC charging, which we will definitely be testing later on in this video. Out of the box, we have OnePlus's Oxygen OS 14.1, which is based on Android 14. Finally, OnePlus claims they will provide 3 years of major updates and 4 years of security updates. This is definitely something I'd love to see increase for future products, given we do have a pretty state-of-the-art chip in the Pad 2. Now, I purchased this OnePlus Pad 2 during their early bird pricing period direct from the OnePlus website, and with the early bird pricing, I was able to get the Pad 2 down to $399 US, which I think is a tremendous value for the tech that's packed in here. The good news is that it does seem that OnePlus still has some promotions available on their website. The OnePlus Pad 2 is available for $549 US at retail, but I definitely recommend taking advantage of their Any Device Trade-in promotion, which takes $50 off, as well as ordering through the OnePlus app for an additional 10% off. Between the two, you can easily knock off more than $100 from the retail price. So let's check out what we get inside the box, but first, just a quick look around the packaging itself. The Pad 2 comes in the signature OnePlus white and red look. It's a very clean and minimalistic package with just some notation on the back. We've got 2 seals to tear open here, so let's get to tearing. There's the first one, and then the second one. Okay, time for the reveal of the contents, and unsurprisingly, the first thing that we are greeted with is the Pad 2, which is wrapped in its plastic sleeve. So let's put this aside for just a moment and continue to check out the rest of the contents. We've got some more red here with what I'm assuming holds some inserts, and it does look like we have the quick guide in here and nothing particularly exciting. Okay, with that out of the way, let's check out the included USB Type-A to Type-C cable here. This is a standard length, and I've always really liked the red cabling that OnePlus uses for their various products. Finally, we have the substantial power block, which provides the capabilities for 67-watt Super VOOC charging, which is actually marked on the charger itself. This should provide some very fast charging times on the Pad 2, and I will be checking that out later on in the battery section. It looks like we're all done with what's included, so let's bring back the star of the show and remove its protective sleeve so we can bask in its glory. You always want to be very gentle when peeling back, it's a very important step. And there it is, looking very much like a tablet. So let's check out the back of the Pad 2. And oh yeah, that's really clean and sleek looking. I have to say I am very impressed by how thin and light it is given the size. I mean seriously, look at how thin this is. Well, we might as well get to the tour and look around the Pad 2 and get familiar with some of its features. Starting out at the top, when in the landscape view, we have the volume up and down button at the left, and a microphone. I like the little edging here. It's an interesting design, which I think is meant to hold the stylus that OnePlus has available for the Pad 2. At the right side, we have 2 of the 6 speakers built into the Pad 2, as well as the USB Type-C port for data, charging, and video out. We have another microphone built in here as well. Now at the bottom, when in landscape mode, at the center we have the pin connection for the Pad 2 magnetic keyboard. Unfortunately, I didn't pick that up, but I will say that I am heavily considering it since, well, I guess I'll spoil it, I actually am enjoying the Pad 2 quite a bit. And now at the left side, when in landscape, we have 2 more speakers as well as the power button. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we have a 12.1-inch 7.5 3K display here with a front-facing 8-megapixel camera that does support facial unlocking. There isn't any fingerprint sensor. At the back, we have a larger than usual rear-facing camera that is 13 megapixels and does support flash. Typically, cameras are not a major selling point for me on tablets, and the ones here on the Pad 2 will not really impress, especially coming from high-end phones. So other than that, this is very clean looking with just the OnePlus logo on the back. The serial information below it can be easily removed. Now the entire back of the Pad 2 is a metal unibody and it definitely feels very premium. So let's go ahead and turn this on for the first time and take a quick look at what ships with this Android build out of the box. You will be greeted with the usual Android setup, so let's go ahead and skip all that and get right into the main screen of Android. OnePlus ships with their Oxygen OS, which has some of their own tweaks. The Pad 2 does ship with Android 14 out of the box, and for the most part, this is a nice and clean install of Android. We do have one preloaded app for Netflix, and then some OnePlus branded apps, but outside of that, this is pretty much all Google here. I will say that I'm immediately noticing just how nice and peppy everything is here. Okay, so one of the more interesting apps I wanted to check out is the OnePlus Games app, and with this app, we can actually bring up some cool features that allows us to bring up a frame counter overlay as well as switch on the fly between different performance profiles like low power, balanced, and something called Pro Gamer mode. Since we typically focus on gaming here on the channel, I did think it was worth pointing out, and I personally like it just for the ability to see frame rates, especially in native Android games. And looking at the Pad 2 overall, the build quality is great here. It's a beautiful looking tablet that does look and feel premium as it should. The finishing of the metal on the back is very nice, as well as the color present here, which does a solid job of limiting the number of fingerprints that are visible on here. The edges are nicely smooth and rounded, and it's a joy to hold and surprisingly not very heavy, coming in at 584 grams or about 1 pound 4 ounces. The display is larger than the one found on the original OnePlus Pad with a 12.1-inch display that pushes a resolution of 3000 by 2120. The display just looks great, and the increased resolution is welcome here since we do have a larger display on hand, which helps to keep things looking sharp even with this screen size. The brightness levels are equally impressive, and when maxed out, this display gets really bright. The same can be said for the brightness scaling, which does a good job of getting dim, especially with the extra dim option for nighttime reading and viewing. Now, another unique thing about the display here compared to other tablets is the 7:5 aspect ratio, which is a nice balance, and considering the type of content you would find yourself consuming on here, it can better accommodate those various aspect ratios. Personally, for me, this tablet is just too large for reading, but given the real estate here, you can actually keep the Pad 2 in its horizontal position and read a book with pages side by side. The real joy comes from using the larger screen when docked, and that's where it will shine the most, especially for those that use their tablets for productivity. On the gaming side, the 7:5 aspect ratio is especially great for something like Game Boy Advance, which will almost fully utilize that display when maintaining integer scaling. Now, one last thing I wanted to highlight in this section were the speakers, and they are equally impressive, especially considering how thin the Pad 2 is, which by the way measures in a svelte 6.5 millimeters. There are 6 speakers packed into this tablet, and I have to say, this tablet can get pretty loud. During my usual battery testing, I had YouTube running at 50% volume, and I could actually sort of hear it playing from the other side of my home. Not only that, but you can go as far as tweaking how multiple audio sources are handled by the tablet with hollow audio, which is pretty neat and quite immersive despite coming from a tablet. So let's now dive into performance, and if numbers aren't your thing, definitely skip ahead. The Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 that's packed into this tablet should prove to be quite the performer, even when taking into consideration the limitations that come with the format and the lack of active cooling. At the end of the day, these are all synthetic tests and really just serves to give us an idea of what we can expect in terms of performance. First up, let's use Geekbench 6 and get a sense of how the CPU performance fares. So we're going to go ahead and turn on the high performance option in Android settings. Of course, you will get a scary warning when doing this, but again, we want to see how much we can push the Pad 2 here. And the numbers are definitely where I'd expect to see a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 device coming in at 2,153 for the single-core score and 6,391 for the multi-core score. The reality is that this tablet won't be able to sustain that high-end performance because of thermals. And so let's turn off that high performance setting, and the single-core score here comes in at 998 and 4,550 for the multi-core score. Now before we switch tests, I thought it would be fun to grab my Odin 2, which has a Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but with active cooling, and even with the high performance setting and sport mode fan on, the best single core score I got was 2,031 and 5,656 for the multi-core score. This is more to show that the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is providing higher numbers overall against the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Let's now switch over to the Wildlife Extreme benchmarks, and with the same testing scenarios from the prior Geekbench testing, let's see how the Pad 2 fares here. Like before, with the Pad 2 set to use high performance, it managed a score of 4,528. And now with the high performance setting turned off, the Pad 2 scored 4,499. And one more time, let's check out how the Odin 2 with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 fared here, with a score of 3,673, and that is using its high performance mode with the fan on. There is definitely a sizable uplift here coming from the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2. Finally, for our last round of benchmarking, let's check out Antutu, which will give us a good overall sense of performance here. So with the high performance mode turned on, the Pad 2 scored 1,854,643 for its overall score, and 420,041 for the CPU, and 801,655 for the GPU. With the high performance mode turned off, the Pad 2 scored 1,664,163 for its overall score, and 375,560 for the CPU, and 776,760 for the GPU. For comparison, here is the Odin 2 again with its Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 set to high performance and using the sport mode fan, which scored 1,539,632 for its overall score, 412,925 for the CPU, and finally 602,392 for the GPU. Let's also quickly check out the Wildlife Extreme stress test, and unsurprisingly with no active cooling, but set to high performance mode in the battery options, the OnePlus Pad 2 has a stability of 82.6%. Now while that may seem unimpressive, we can see that the scores do stabilize after about the 5 to 6 minute mark with a very minimal drop to complete the test. Okay, so longtime viewers of the channel, or at least the Retro Handhelds podcast, know that I love my telescopic controllers, which can turn pretty much any tablet into a great dedicated gaming handheld. Now, of course, we're dealing with a much larger tablet, so our options will be limited in terms of what will actually fit the OnePlus Pad 2. But I did round up a few that will work here, and so I have the Gamesir X2S, ShadowBlade 2, which is just a rebadge of the Gamesir Galileo G8, the BSP D9, and my newest addition here with the Gamesir G8 Plus. And of course, I will have links to all of these options in my description. All of these controls fit great right out of the box on the Pad 2. The only one that will need a modification is the original G8 Galileo or ShadowBlade 2 that I have on hand here. I will point you to my good friend Shem over at RetroBreeze, who covers modding the original Galileo G8, but for those that don't want to do any of that, the G8 Plus will work right out of the box on large tablets. The G8 Plus is a Bluetooth-enabled telescopic controller, and if you gently do the pop and lock on it, you will be able to expand it to fit the Pad 2. Despite the Pad 2 having a nicely centered USB-C port, I do like that with a Bluetooth controller like the G8 Plus, we can position the tablet in any way that works best. If you want to know more about the G8 Plus, I will have a link to my good friend Klef over at Game Tech Talks, who has done several videos about the G8 Plus and really dives in deep for these telescopic controllers. And for what it's worth, the G8 Plus has become my personal favorite for tablet devices. We have one more Gamesir controller here with the X2S, and this does use a USB Type-C connection, so you will not be able to position this outside of the way it is here. The X2S, like the G8 Plus, does not need any modding, but I will say that the pop and lock on this one is much harder to do, but once done, you can likewise fit it on the Pad 2. The X2S has a very different feel compared to the G8 and G8 Plus, and personally is my least favorite out of these 4 options. But for those that like clicky buttons and a slightly more compact controller, the X2S is a solid option. Finally, we have the BSP D9, which is probably most known for its imitation of the PlayStation Portal and PlayStation 5 controller style. The BSP D9 is surprisingly a decent option, and the cheapest one here. Like the G8 Plus, we have Bluetooth here, and so we can position the Pad 2 freely in the D9. Of course, for podcast viewers, there's been a running trend of me showing off this controller, expanding it as wide as it can go, and let me tell you, it gets real wide. The BSP D9 will fit the Pad 2, a 12.1-inch tablet, without any modification or pop and locking. My biggest criticism of the D9 has remained the same across various tablets, and it mostly has to do with how secure the tablet feels when docked in this controller, especially for a larger one like the Pad 2, so just keep that in mind when considering this as an option. So now that we are properly equipped and we've ran all the numbers, let's finally check out some native Android gaming on the Pad 2, which should prove to be quite a treat given that we have a Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 on board. Throughout this portion, I will let you know my settings on screen. Let's start out with a fairly recent release. Star Wars Hunters is a free-to-play online multiplayer third-person shooter that is actually a ton of fun to play, and I've been enjoying this one on and off on various Android devices. The game offers a variety of settings to tweak here, but with the Pad 2, I've got everything turned up as much as I can with ultra settings, anti-aliasing, 60 frames per second, and a max fixed resolution scale of 100. I'm using OnePlus's game optimization with the Pad 2 set to the low power mode, and this game is having no trouble at all here with these settings, staying locked to 60 frames per second. The game is a real treat on this beautiful and large display, especially paired with the G8 Plus here. It's just an absolute blast. And of course, it's almost impossible to not talk about Call of Duty Warzone in the mobile space, and speaking of games that are just a blast, it's pretty easy to get hooked on Warzone, especially when it looks and plays this well. For the Pad 2, we are using the peak visual quality and high for every other setting, including FPS, resolution, upscaling quality, and shadow quality. Basically, we've got everything turned up here, and I'm continuing to use the low power mode with the OnePlus game optimization, since it seems to be doing quite well staying at the 60 frames per second target. Again, pairing up Warzone with a solid telescopic controller and with the big screen, it's a pretty awesome experience. I definitely can tell I've been on smaller devices and tablets a bit too much, since I'm appreciating all the details in both this game and Star Wars Hunters. Now let's check out some Fortnite, which probably needs no introduction, being yet another very popular online multiplayer game from Epic Games. I've been asked this question a lot when it comes to Fortnite, and if you are looking to download Fortnite, the game is available through the Epic Games Store app. You will need to go to the Fortnite website, which is simply Fortnite.com, and then download the app from there. Anyways, Fortnite is another real treat on here, and for this one, I'm going to be pushing 90 frames per second, which it does maintain on this tablet with some occasional dips here and there during the initial drop. But we are set to max out every setting possible here, with the quality presets set to epic and a static 100% 3D resolution with high texture quality. Once on the ground, things are very smooth and it looks and plays great. Again, it's really awesome when paired with a controller. Not only that, but I am yet again using the low power mode with the game optimization app. Diablo Immortal is another popular game in the mobile world, and yet again for this game we are using low power mode and it's staying at 60 frames per second, which is awesome considering the game is set to very high settings, 60 FPS and high resolution. I think we are starting to see a bit of a pattern here when it comes to Android gaming, and it's becoming very clear that the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is handling things quite well. So let's move on to Zenless Zone Zero, which is a very recent release and comes to us from the folks that brought us games like Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail. This is a pretty interesting game with some different gameplay elements, and I've found it pretty fun despite the usual free-to-play mechanics. For Zenless Zone Zero, we are yet again using maxed out settings, so it's going to be either high or ultra depending on the setting, and in low power mode, the game stays locked to 60 frames per second even when we're out in the city area. While we're on the topic of ZZZ, we might as well bring in some Genshin Impact and do a quick run through to see how this game fares on here. And like ZZZ, we are using all of the highest settings available for this game at 60 frames per second, and not only does this game look absolutely gorgeous on display, it's running incredibly well. So let's switch up genres, and we have the long-running Asphalt Legends, which saw the new Unite expansion update not too long ago. This one is a fun free-to-play arcade racing game that at this point is a staple of the Android platform and Google Play Store. Based on what we've seen, I don't think it's much of a surprise that this game is having no issues on the Pad 2, using the high-quality graphics settings, and we are still set to use that low-power mode with the OnePlus game optimization. The graphics look great, gameplay is fast and smooth, and this one is always a blast despite the ridiculous amount of ads that plagues this game unfortunately. Thankfully, there are some great racing games that are premium experiences, and so to wrap up this Android gaming showcase, let's check out some Wreckfest, which isn't a new Android experience, receiving a native port to the platform some time ago. Regardless, this is an awesome full premium experience that is well worth the price of admission and can be quite the demanding game for devices. Wreckfest is another game that we can push everything and turn the settings way up with everything set to max, high, extreme, or ultra. And just like every other Android game featured here, Wreckfest is having no troubles staying at full speed with all of the maxed out settings. After all of this, I think it's very clear that even the most demanding of Android games will have no issues on the Pad 2, and the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 is proving to be quite the performer and should provide some longevity for those looking to keep a device around for some time. But now it's time for some emulation, which is always my favorite part and one of the best ways to push new hardware and give us a sense of how far we can push the hardware here on the Pad 2. Oh yeah, and fair warning, I'm a heathen and you will see some stretched footage here because the display is just too good not to fully utilize. And speaking of utilizing this display, like I mentioned before, with the 7:5 aspect ratio, one of the platforms I was most excited to try out was actually Game Boy Advance. And obviously based on what we've seen so far, the Pad 2 will barely break a sweat emulating the Game Boy Advance. Now Game Boy Advance uses a 3:2 aspect ratio, and if we were to maintain integer scaling, we could get away with 12 times the native resolution, utilizing 11.4 inches of the 12.1 inches available, which means that we will have very minimal borders when doing integer scaling here, and so Game Boy Advance just looks really great on this tablet. But let's actually push the Pad 2 a bit harder, and for every platform tested from this point on, I will be using the high performance option in Android settings. So let's continue on with another Nintendo platform using the Dolphin emulator straight from the Play Store. Let's jump into one of the more commonly known Gamecube games used to benchmark performance with some F-Zero GX. And at this point, we've maxed out the resolution scaling available to us in Dolphin, with F-Zero GX set to use 6 times the native resolution, or the equivalent to 4K. Now keep in mind that this is completely unnecessary, and you can easily turn down the upscaling to save on the battery life. And it's much of the same when we move over to the Wii. Things are really looking very solid here as well. I tested Super Mario Galaxy 2 using the same 6 times native resolution, and performance is just awesome. The game is a real treat at this resolution, especially on this big screen. So let's now hop on over to the Sony platforms and start out with some PlayStation Portable using PPSSPP. Now typically I do my stretching before working out, but I do have to stretch the 16:9 aspect ratio here for the PSP since I just love this large screen. Now everything's gonna look a little bit skinnier than usual, but it's okay, we're just here to see how things perform, and unsurprisingly, PSP is a real treat, easily getting up to 10 times native resolution for the majority of the library. I tested some of my go-to favorites like Outrun 2006, and of course everyone's favorite benchmarking game, God of War: Chains of Olympus. But for those familiar with emulation, I think we knew the results would be solid for PSP, so let's move up a notch and check out some PlayStation 2 emulation using Nether SX2. Likewise, I rounded up an assortment of good benchmarking games as well as some personal favorites, and things just ran really well here. For the most demanding games, I was able to get away with a 4 times native upscaling, and for the lighter games like one of my favorite hidden gems, Thunder Force 6, which was a Japanese exclusive release for the PlayStation 2, I was able to turn native upscaling to the max available in Nether SX2, which is 8 times the native PS2 resolution. I will say that it's absolutely absurd to scale these games that much, since at 8 times we are now upscaling beyond the resolution of the display here on the Pad 2. Regardless, games like God of War 2 and Shadow of the Colossus were playing comfortably using a 4 times native upscale without any issues with the frame rate. And even another favorite game of mine, Black, was able to hit 6 times native resolution, which means we have plenty of headroom to enable patches such as the 60 frames per second that's available for Black. Okay, so let's head back into Nintendo land again and close things up in the emulation section with 2 more platforms that are definitely worth looking at. Let's check out some Nintendo 3DS emulation with Citra using OpenGL, and here we have Super Mario 3D Land running at 6 times the native resolution of the 3DS, which is the max available to us in Citra. Now 3DS performance will vary based on the game, but expect that most will be able to push those higher resolutions. Now my longtime viewers know just how much I love DS and 3DS emulation, and typically for a tablet, I will turn it into the portrait mode so that we can get the displays on the top and the bottom. But given that we have so much screen real estate here, you can honestly just leave the Pad 2 in landscape and still have an awesome experience either going with a single screen setup or the various options available here. And finally, let's briefly talk about Nintendo Switch emulation, which has had a bit of a rocky year for Android. Now I will specifically be using Sudachi for my emulation tests with Switch, and again, given that development is all over the place, don't expect that it's all going to be perfect, despite having the power of the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 on hand. Regardless, games like Super Mario Wonder using handheld mode is a solid performer here with the Pad 2, staying at a nice and consistent 50 frames per second using the latest turnip drivers. And for one more Mario game, let's check out Super Mario Odyssey, which is working exceptionally well here with Sudachi using turnip drivers, and I tested both docked 1080p mode as well as utilizing 2x native upscaling in handheld mode, which allows the game to run at 1440p. Both options worked great, but I will say that I do prefer playing in docked mode despite the higher resolution that we get with the handheld mode. Game performance will naturally vary between different games, but there will be a portion of the library that will be able to run at that 2x native resolution, allowing Switch games to be played in 1440p or 4K resolutions. So one last thing I wanted to show off was just some game streaming from my local PC using Moonlight with Sunshine. This is a fun way to really utilize the 144Hz refresh rate panel that we have here with the Pad 2. For this streaming test, I will be using Ori and the Will of the Wisps, which will be streaming locally from my PC that is hardwired to my network. I've got Ori set to use high settings with a 144 frames per second cap and at 1080p resolution. The performance is really solid here with Moonlight on the Pad 2, and of course a lot of this has to do with the strength of your own home network, which you can see based on the stats, my network is having no issues streaming over Wi-Fi to the Pad 2 at 144 frames per second. The native decoding time is pretty solid as well at around 9 milliseconds, which I think is quite good given the settings we have here. So no doubt about it, the Pad 2 can handle quite a lot of different gaming situations, and so it's time to see how the 9510 mAh battery fares in this tablet. As usual, I'll start out with a lighter test, with my endless YouTube test using the low power mode, 50% brightness, 50% volume, and I was able to get a whole lot of classic game room streaming with the Pad 2, which managed over 17.5 hours of on-screen time using YouTube at 1080p. The Pad 2 will certainly make a good companion for a long-distance flight, just sipping on that battery. Now I wanted to compare my own results against the claims by OnePlus in terms of charging capabilities with that Super VOC adapter. My Pad 2 reached about 45% in 30 minutes, which is a bit off from OnePlus's claims of 64% in 30 minutes, which they apparently timed from 1% and not 0%. Now my 0 to 100% charging time came in at about 1 hour 25 minutes, which is very close to matching the stated performance by OnePlus, and pretty solid given the large battery here. And for light retro gaming, I was able to catch the recording at just the right moment, but using my usual Yoshi's Island for Super Nintendo with the SNES 9X core in RetroArch, and the low power mode with 50% brightness and volume with Wi-Fi and Bluetooth still on, we hit almost 12.5 hours of on-screen gaming time. And finally, pushing the Pad 2 with some high-end emulation, and this time around we'll hop into some God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2, using Nether SX2 with the game set to use 4x native resolution, and with the Pad 2 set to high performance battery mode, God of War 2 at 50% brightness and volume managed just shy of 3.5 hours. Notice that I was able to leave God of War 2 running at 4x native resolution without any thermal throttling, reducing performance in-game. And speaking of that, it's the perfect time to talk about thermals. The tablet for most operations didn't really get warm at all, with it really only being noticeable around the camera area when we start to push it pretty hard. Now we saw in the Wildlife Extreme stress test that it scored around 82% for stability, but the reality is that for everything I've done in this video, I never experienced a loss of performance due to thermals. The amount of power available to us with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 allows the tablet to scale down as needed while still providing a great experience. As another example here, I've had F0GX running at 6x native resolution for more than an hour straight, and frame rates were consistent throughout the time. Remember, we're doing this without any kind of active cooling in a very slim device. And overall, I didn't observe any temperatures on the chassis going above 40 degrees Celsius. I think it's pretty clear that the OnePlus Pad 2 is a pretty impressive value for the amount of power that you're getting in a tablet with many nice features that definitely make it stand out, not just against a stream of tablets, but against some of the best performers in this space like the iPad and offerings from Samsung. The Pad 2 improves on its predecessor and offers more power and value than ever before. I would love to see OnePlus increase their commitments to updates to match those of Google's at 7 years, given the powerful hardware on hand here, which should serve many for a long time. I'd love to see OnePlus come back with a successor that offers an OLED panel, but despite that, I think this is a solid overall package and is easily the best performing tablet in the Android space now, so for those that enjoy gaming on a big screen, the Pad 2 won't disappoint. And I hope that this video didn't disappoint. As always, I love hearing from viewers, so don't be shy and comment down below with your thoughts. I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.